I never thought I would be in a lesbian infidelity story, but my love for Aisha turned into a secret love affair, one that would change my life forever. This wasn't just a fling, it was a true lesbian love story, a connection deeper than anything I had ever known. My name is Amina, and I am 29 years old. I come from a world where a woman's happiness is measured by how well she serves her husband. A world where love is not something you choose, but something that is handed to you in the form of duty, of obedience, of silence. I was the sixth wife, not the first, who held his name with pride, not the second, who still clung to dreams of romance, not the third, who had learned to love him despite his flaws, not the fourth, who had given up and simply existed, not even the fifth, who at least had children to call her own. Number Y was the sixth, the forgotten one, the unnecessary one, the one added not out of passion nor out of necessity, but because men like him could, and that was reason enough. The other wives were not cruel, nor were they kind. We lived like distant relatives forced to share a home, bound by a man who barely remembered our names when he wasn't summoning us to his bed. There was no intimacy, no warmth, just duty. I used to dream of love, I used to believe in it. But now I spent my days existing, cooking, cleaning, sitting quietly while my husband spoke, lowering my gaze when he passed, forcing a smile when he chose me for the night. I hated it, but what could I do? There was no escape. So I cried, and the only place I could do so in peace was the public bathhouse. It wasn't a glamorous place, just a space where women from the compound would come to clean themselves, to gossip, to exist outside the walls of their husbands' homes. But for me, it was something more. It was where I broke, where I let the tears fall because there was nowhere else to put them. Where I let myself feel. Because inside my husband's house, there was no space for feeling. I was careful. I always waited until the bathhouse was empty, my back against the cold tiled wall, my knees pulled to my chest, my tears silent so that no one would hear. It was my only escape, until that day, until her. It started with a knock, sharp, firm, insistent. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. "Excuse me," a voice called. A woman's voice, low, calm, unfamiliar. I wiped my tears quickly, pressing my palms against my eyes, trying to steady my breath. I couldn't be seen like this. I couldn't be weak. Another knock. "I need to use the bathroom," the woman said again. I swallowed hard, my pulse racing. I don't know why, but something about her voice made me hesitate. Something about it felt different. I stood slowly, my hands trembling as I reached for the door. And then I opened it, and I saw her. She was staring at me. Not in the way a husband stares when he's choosing a wife for the night. Not in the way the older wives stare when they silently judge you. Not even in the way the market women do when they gossip about things they shouldn't. Her stare was different. It was sharp but not unkind, curious but not intrusive. And then she spoke. "Are you okay?" Her voice was softer this time. Gentle. Almost too gentle. And it was that softness that broke me. I didn't know her. I had never seen her before. She was just a woman knocking on a bathroom door, but somehow, in that moment, I couldn't hold it in anymore. I sobbed. Not the small, controlled tears I had perfected over time. This was different. This was my chest heaving, my shoulders shaking, my whole body collapsing into the weight of my own sadness. I was tired. Of the quiet suffering. Of the endless days. Of being nothing but a name on a list of wives. I pressed my hands to my face, ashamed, but the woman simply stepped forward and placed a firm, warm hand on my shoulder. Dear, it's okay," she whispered. I wanted to believe her. I didn't expect to see her again. Women like us didn't just meet. We existed in the same world, but we weren't meant to cross paths beyond the occasional forced gatherings in the compound. And yet, later that evening, I found myself sitting in her home, staring down at a small glass of hibiscus tea she had placed in front of me. Her name was Aisha. She was 26, and she was the fourth wife. Not the favorite, not the least favorite. Somewhere in between. Unlike me, Aisha had an air of defiance about her. The kind that wasn't loud or rebellious, but subtle. The way she held her glass with ease, the way she sat with her legs crossed, the way she smiled like she had secrets the world would never guess. She watched me for a moment before tilting her head. "You look like you expect me to poison you." I startled, realizing I hadn't touched the tea. "No, I just—" "Relax," she said, sipping her own drink. "We're not in our husband's house. You can breathe here." I let out a shaky exhale and took a cautious sip. The sweetness spread over my tongue, the coldness a sharp contrast to the heat rising in my chest. It had been so long since I sat with someone like this. Since I spoke freely. Since I laughed. At first, I was tense, afraid to say too much, afraid to be too much. But Aisha made it easy. She started small, asking about my day, about the routine I followed. And soon, we were both laughing over how predictable our lives had become. "How many times does he call your name in a week?" Aisha asked, eyes sparkling with mischief. I rolled my eyes. "Depends. If he wants food, it's twice. If he wants me in his bed, it's once." Aisha gasped dramatically. "Once? You must be special. He calls me only when he wants me to pass him his slippers." I burst out laughing. It wasn't proper. It wasn't dignified. But for the first time in a long time, I felt light. We talked about everything. The ridiculous fights between the other wives, the secret alliances, the unspoken rules of who sat where at family gatherings. We laughed at it all. Because what else could we do? And when I left that evening, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. I felt seen. The next day I went back. And the day after that. And the day after that. I escaped to Aisha's house at every chance I got. Some days we sat in her living room drinking sweet tea, talking about things that mattered and things that didn't. Other days we played games. Silly, childish games. Aisha had a small set of wooden puzzles, the kind meant for children, but we would sit for hours, pretending we were strategizing something important. "This is serious," Aisha would say, placing a piece carefully. "This is the difference between me winning and you crying." "Please," I'd scoff. "You're just pretending to be smart." "Maybe, but I do it well, don't I?" And she did. She did everything well. Too well. And maybe that was the problem. Because every day that I spent with Aisha, I felt something growing inside me. Something dangerous. Something I should not feel. But I ignored it. Because for once in my life, I was happy. I was used to the sound of laughter in Aisha's home. Used to the warm scent of hibiscus tea brewing in the corner. Used to her voice calling out with some teasing remark the moment I stepped inside. But today, there was nothing. The house was silent. I knocked once, then twice. No answer. A small frown crept onto my face as I reached for the door and realized it was slightly open. Aisha never left her door open. I hesitated for a moment before pushing it gently. The house felt different. Still. Too still. "Aisha," I called out, stepping inside cautiously. Nothing. I glanced around. The cushions were slightly askew, as if someone had been here recently. The scent of tea still lingered faintly in the air. But where was she? I took another step forward, my heartbeat picking up just slightly. "Aisha?" Still nothing. Just as I was about to turn back, I heard it. A sound, soft, muffled, coming from the back of the house. From her bedroom. I froze for a moment, my breath catching in my throat. Was she hurt? Was someone else here? The thoughts raced through my mind as I found myself moving towards the door, drawn forward by something I couldn't explain. I didn't have to knock. The door was slightly open, and when I looked inside, I froze. Aisha was there, but she wasn't asleep. She wasn't unaware. She was lost in something else entirely. Something intimate. Her head was tilted back, her lips parted slightly, her fingers moving slowly, deliberately, in a way that made my entire body tense. I felt my stomach tighten, my face grow hot, a rush of something I didn't know how to name spreading through me. I should have turned away, I should have left, pretended I saw nothing. But I didn't. My breath hitched, and before I could stop myself, a small whimper slipped from my lips. Aisha's movements stilled. For a split second, everything was silent. And then, she turned her head. Her gaze met mine. I expected shock, embarrassment, a hurried attempt to cover herself, to explain, to act as though this moment had never happened. But she didn't do any of that. She smiled. I should have left. I should have turned on my heels, muttered some awkward apology, and never returned. But I didn't. I stood there, heat crawling up my neck, my breath shallow, my heart hammering so loudly I was sure she could hear it. Aisha didn't look embarrassed, not at all. Instead, she smirked. "Are you just going to stand there, or are you coming in?" she asked, her voice smooth, almost teasing. I swallowed. "Come in as how?" Aisha tilted her head. "As how?" she repeated. "Amina, don't be shy. Just come in." Shy? Shy was an understatement. I felt my entire body tense, my hands clenching into the fabric of my dress as I hesitated. But then, as if my legs had a will of their own, I stepped inside, keeping my gaze firmly on the floor. The room felt smaller than usual, or maybe it was just the weight of what I had seen that made the air feel thick between us. I stood there, unmoving, waiting. For what, I didn't know. Aisha, however, was completely at ease. She leaned back on the bed, stretching slightly before patting the space beside her. "Sit." I shook my head immediately. I don't think this is right. Aisha's laughter was soft, almost indulgent. "Amina?" she sighed, shaking her head. "You're acting like this is some great sin. It's nothing new under the sun." She raised an eyebrow. "Or don't you... ever?" My stomach twisted. My lips parted, then closed. I knew what she was asking. And the truth was, I didn't. I had never even thought to. I had never been given a reason to. So I shook my head, my voice barely above a whisper. "I don't even know how." Aisha's expression shifted from teasing to surprise. "You're serious?" I nodded, feeling my face burn with shame. Aisha leaned forward slightly, studying me. "Then how do you cope, being the sixth wife and all?" I clenched my jaw, my hands tightening in my lap. I just don't think about it." Aisha hummed as if considering my words. "So what? Your needs are always met?" I glanced up at her sharply. "Is this really something we should be discussing?" She laughed again, her voice light, unbothered. "Why not? It's just us, Amina. No husbands, no expectations. Just two women having a conversation." Just a conversation. Then why did my heart feel like it was about to leap out of my chest? Aisha patted the bed again. "Come closer, I want to show you something." I hesitated. This was dangerous. This was wrong. But I still took a step forward. And another, until I was sitting beside her, my body stiff, my hands gripping my knees. She was close, too close. And then she closed the space entirely. Her fingers found my chin, tilting my face towards hers. My breath caught. Her thumb grazed my cheek gently. And before I could even think, before I could remind myself that I was a married woman, before I could process the fact that this was Aisha, another man's wife, she kissed me. Software warm, certain. A small gasp escaped me, my lips parting just slightly in shock. I should have pulled away, but I didn't. Because for the first time in my life, someone had touched me like this. Not out of duty, not because it was expected, but because they wanted to. And just like that. We explored it together, in the quiet of Aisha's room. It was a beautiful thing, what we had. Aisha and I no longer hid. Not in the way we did before, when every glance felt like a risk, every meeting a stolen moment. No, we had grown comfortable. She would come to me. I would go to her. We walked through the streets together, side by side, as if the world around us didn't matter. At the market, we bargained for fruit, our hands brushing over baskets of ripe mangoes, pretending not to notice the lingering touch. At her home, we sat cross-legged on the floor, playing games, laughing so hard our stomachs ached. At night, when we lay in separate homes, separate beds, under the roofs of separate men, I thought of her. I thought of the way she smiled at me, the way she held my gaze a second too long, the way she knew me without me ever needing to explain. Everything was perfect, until it wasn't. It started with a fever, then nausea, then the vomiting. At first, she brushed it off, waving a hand dismissively. "Bad food," she said, rolling her eyes. But it wasn't bad food. It was something else. I was there when she took the test. I was there when she sat on the edge of the bed, her fingers gripping the fabric of her dress, her face pale with realization. I was there when the tears slipped silently down her cheeks, her lips pressed together so tightly I thought she might never speak again. Aisha was pregnant, his 16th child. I watched her, not knowing what to say. Her body shook. She clenched her fists so tightly her knuckles turned white. And then she broke. She sobbed into her hands, shoulders trembling, the woman I had always seen as fearless suddenly falling apart in front of me. I swallowed the lump in my throat, stepping forward. Aisha. She didn't look up. I wrapped my arms around her, pressing my cheek against her shoulder. I felt her shudder beneath me. "It's going to be okay," I whispered. I wasn't sure if I was lying. That night, I couldn't sleep. I tossed and turned, my mind circling her pain, her exhaustion, her trapped future. I thought of what this meant for her, for us. Would this be the end? Would we go back to pretending? Would she shrink into the role expected of her, the way I once had? No, I couldn't let that happen. And then, an idea formed in my mind. It was absurd. It was impossible. And yet, the next day, as we walked side by side to the market, I turned to her and said the words before I could stop myself. "Aisha," I whispered, "why don't we run away?" She blinked at me as if she misheard. I took a breath, my voice growing bolder. "We can leave. Find somewhere new. Somewhere none of this matters. Somewhere we can just be." Aisha stared at me. And then she laughed. Not softly, not gently. She threw her head back, her body shaking, the kind of laughter that made my stomach sink. "Amina, are you serious?" She chuckled, shaking her head. "Run away? And go where? Do what? You really think we could survive out there?" I shrunk under her gaze, embarrassed. I dropped it. For now. But the thought wouldn't leave my mind. So I brought it up again. And again. And every time I did, Aisha's smile grew thinner. Her patience, shorter. Then one day she snapped. We had been sitting together in her home drinking tea when I said it again. "What if we just get out?" I froze. Aisha's face was hard, her jaw clenched, her hands shaking slightly. Her voice was sharp, cutting through me like a blade. "Get out," she repeated, her tone leaving no room for argument. I stared at her, my lips parting, waiting for her to laugh it off. She didn't. Instead, her eyes burned into mine, filled with something I had never seen before. Anger, frustration, fear. "You are not wise, Amina," she hissed, shaking her head. "You live in a dream. You don't understand how the world works." I swallowed hard, and then I left. I told myself I would let it go. Forget her. Forget what she made me feel. That night, as I lay beside my husband, my body stiff as his breathing evened out beside me, I told myself that this was how things were meant to be. That this was my life. That I had been foolish to think otherwise. But then, out of nowhere, his voice cut through the darkness. Low, amused, too knowing. "Amina, Did you really think I wouldn't notice the way you look at her? My blood ran cold. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I froze. Because somehow he knew.